and questions, and I would encourage you, to use the chat function to ask questions during the presentation, and if we can get to them, we certainly will. And so with that, context for TDR. The GSA schedule contracting, the same is true for VA schedule contracting, even though it's not subject to TDR, has long had both a pre-award and a post-award pricing component to schedule contracting that's very unique. So prior to award, you have to disclose to GSA your sales and discounting practices for all of your non-federal domestic customers, and you have to certify that the data you're providing is current, accurate, and complete. We're not going to get into that today except to say that the rules for filling out a CSP1 are not very clear. Nobody knows exactly what's required, but to do it in a way that you feel comfortable with, it takes quite a bit of effort in terms of sales data analysis that people like Tom are really good at, and crafting a description of everything you're doing commercially in terms of sales and discounting practices.
In a way that I look at that is on the commercial side, and why it's been so difficult and why industry's objected is that you're competing with yourself at that point to try to do it correctly, given the ambiguous rules and the vagaries that are there. And competing against yourself is something that can be a bit weird for a commercial organization to try and wrap their head around.
Exactly. And then so you've got this pre-award disclosure and certification requirement that's a burden to do, and also comes with quite a bit of compliance risk. And we're not, going to walk through the parade of horribles, but anyone who's spent any time studying the schedules program has seen the False Claims Act settlements that relate to pre-award pricing disclosures on the schedule. And also the second one, which is post-award, you have to monitor your commercial pricing for sales that would trigger an obligation under the price reductions clause to decrease your GSA schedule price, at least for a period of time. Industry has always hated these. They're a unique burden as compared to other commercial item contracts, which are fixed price in the true sense of the word and don't have these pricing disclosure and risk associated with them. It's long been argued that they're inconsistent with commercial practices, and OFPP did not agree with that. But I think for those of us, Tom, I'll see what your opinion is, but having spent a long time in industry, you don't get to ask, if you're selling to GE, they can't ask you to provide all of your other customer discounts and certify that it's true with penalties for not.
No.
And there is an MFC in commercial contracts, but it's not the same.
It's not the same. Most favored nations is a different concept, and because it's commercial, you, as you said, tend to have the ability to negotiate that or frame it. And while, yes, there's always the risk of some sort of commercial litigation, if it goes sideways, you tend to end up with a customer relationship issue around that rather than a legal or compliance issue that could significantly affect the company as a whole.
So as background, industry hates these two pricing requirements, has been griping about them for a long time. In response to this, GSA appointed a multiple award schedule advisory panel that actually did take issue or did indicate that the price reductions clause was not a great idea. I, for one, thought it was never going to change because the IG likes it, but in any event, 2010 forward, they begin working on this, make that recommendation. GSA, at the same time that industry is grousing about, these non-commercial requirements and all the burden and risk associated with them. At the same time, GSA is taking pot shots from OMB, GAO, and others within the federal government that the pricing on schedule is not especially good, and not what the government could be getting if it was managed properly. And I frankly think that, and I'd be interested, Tom's got a better view of this than I do, but my view on that is that actually at the order level, GSA schedule pricing is working pretty well. I know when I was in-house, our lowest margins on any contract vehicle we had company-wide was our GSA schedule contract. So I'm not sure it's valid, but certainly they were taking quite a bit of heat.
Yeah, internally in the organizations that I was in-house, the GSA Schedule price point was one that was, almost considered to be sacrosanct. If you wanted to go beyond that or do something different, it required a greater deal of oversight, adult supervision, whatever it was. Because as Matt said, while margin doesn't really factor into the actual process, it does have relevance inside an organization, and they're going to want to know if customer A is suddenly now going to affect an entire segment, that being the one that's represented by the GSA contract.
So, yeah, I think we're in violent agreement on this.
Yes.
And so TDR is intended to facilitate horizontal pricing analysis, which is essentially a methodology for analyzing and finding best prices by comparing like sales of the same items. And so TDR is intended to allow government buyers and GSA contracting officers to have information about same contract sales of the same items to use as a basis for price comparison and theoretically arrive at a better price. What's interesting to geeks like Tom and me, hope you don't mind me calling you geek.
Nope.
Okay. It fits, so.
Thanks.
The price reductions clause was modified in 1994 to exempt federal sales as triggering events. And what happened, over time, way back in history, was that contractors were unwilling to pass on spot discounts to federal government agencies because they would then trigger a price reduction event and have to provide it to everybody else, and so they were losing out on this. And so it's obviously different than the price reductions clause used to be, but nevertheless, we're now suddenly back to the point where the focal point of price analysis under the schedule is going to be federal end-user order pricing. So it's in some ways a circling back to where we used to be on this. So, continuing with an overview of the rule itself, important to understand that TDR is only for designated GSA schedule contracts, and we'll give you that list. You're probably already familiar with it. So it does not apply to the VA FSS contracts that VA administers through a delegation from GSA for medical supplies, equipment, and some services. So if you're, a VA schedule contractor only, you can sign off and get on with your day. And what TDR really does is it offers contractors a trade-off, or provides contractors a trade-off, because eventually it's going to be mandatory for all scheduled contractors. You get relief from both the pre- and post-award pricing models that we talked about, the CSPs and the price reductions clause. And that's a double benefit for contractors. It's important to understand because you're relieved from the burden of having to, research and prepare CSPs, but you're also relieved from the associated compliance risk from having submitted CSPs, which is the type of thing that keeps people like me up at night if I'm in-house, or keeps me employed if I'm outside counsel. And so that is actually quite a significant benefit to contractors that accept TDR.
And doing a CSP properly, and we'll kind of talk about this, I think, a little bit later on when we look at the, some of the trade-offs or benefits of opting in or opting out. Doing a CSP properly is not a small undertaking. So, it's an important thing. Contractors who recognize and acknowledge its burden but still wanted to play in the market, that was an overhead cost, really, that they had to deal with. And so, yeah, it is a very significant change. I mean, I remember when the price reduction clause changed in 1994 and sales teams started going crazy being able to do spot pricing. This is a very, very transformative event right now in GSA contracting.
I mean, think about it. I mean, you're going to, if you have $2 billion in domestic commercial sales, you've got to sift through that many $1 billion of individual sales and be aware of what happened. And I say this in part because many of my best friends are sales executives, but there's almost no end to the imagination and creativity of what salespeople can do to close a transaction. And so that's all information that has to be collected and potentially disclosed at CSP. So this really is a huge burden that contractors are being relieved of. And in exchange for that, contractors will now have to submit a monthly report of sales transactions under their GSA Schedule contracts that have designated fields of information about those orders. And you know, we'll get into some of the finer points of that, but that's at its core, that's the trade-off that TDR provides. Note, and this is outside the scope of what Tom and I are going to talk about today, but TDR applies also to new GSA, GWACs, and non-schedule indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, or IDIQ contracts. And so new awards in that context are going to be subject to TDR as well. Not generally, GSA has to be the contracting entity, but that's outside the scope of the course, but we did want to note that it was part of the deal. TDR, this is something that's important to understand, has been issued on a pilot program basis. So it's been issued not to all schedules, although when we look at the list, I mean, I haven't done the numbers, I haven't seen anybody do the numbers, but it's got to be close to half of the revenue, given some of the schedules that are in the...
Yeah, between 40 and 50%, I think, depending on what basis you want to measure it from.
Okay. So it's a large pilot program, yeah, but it is nevertheless a pilot program. And so it's not necessarily permanent, and it may be that when GSA evaluates the success of the program after a year, particularly after some of the issues that we're going to forecast as problems, they may decide to scrap it and go right back to where we are. And so it's important to understand that it is on an interim or pilot basis as currently issued. The implementation is through an alternate to the IFF, or the Industrial Funding Fee and Sales Reporting Clause. And so if you agree to TDR, the mechanism for that will be to include this new GSA acquisition regulation clause in your contract. Specifies the monthly reporting. Even though it's the IFF clause that does this, the IFF payments are still on a quarterly basis. So you report the information that comprises your IFF quarterly payment on a monthly basis in greater detail, but it doesn't change the payment date for IFF, which is a question we've gotten a few times. There are other alternates to standard clause, scheduled contract clauses that implement, you know, some of the good side of TDR, i.e. Getting rid of the price reductions clause and the CSP submission requirements. So there are other standard clauses that will be a little bit different as mechanics for implementing this. And for those of you that are nerdy, we've included the final rule as an attachment. And it is interesting, this rule it garnered so much attention in its various, you know, proposed stages. And the most recent set of questions are repeated and answered by GSA in the final rule, and it gives some insight into, you know, the thought process and strategy at GSA about TDR. Other way. Okay, so as I mentioned, contractors have to submit a monthly report of sales orders placed against just their scheduled contracts, and they can do it based on the invoice date or the payment date for the order. I've never seen anybody other than very small contractors be able to manage payment date very efficiently, so our assumption is that contractors that elect TDR will generally choose the invoice date as the date for keying their TDR reports. Transactional data is a defined term. It's historical details of the products or services delivered by the contractor during the task or delivery orders issued against this contract. And so it's important. I've seen some question other places about, well, does this mean I have to report all my federal sales transactions? No, it's sales under this contract. And the monthly reports have 11 data elements which are listed below. I'm not going to read through each of them, but I will note that GSA's current thinking is that only 2 of the 11 data elements will be exempt from the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, and that's quantity of items sold and price paid per unit. There is a Federal Register solicitation of comments on what should and should not be FOIA exempt within the TDR fields, and that's something that you can comment on.
I find that interesting because while they are saying right now that the quantity of the items sold and the price paid per unit is out, if you have any competitive understanding of your marketplace with the 9 fields that remain, you can get a pretty good idea of what the price, or at least the average price, is. Never mind the requirement to still keep your GSA schedule pricing posted. So you can start to do that, and so I'm not sure what they're getting by just withholding those 2 attributes.
That's awfully practical, Tom.
I'm sorry. I'm a practical guy.
But I think, you know, having done a certain amount of FOIA or reverse FOIA litigation myself, which is when you reverse FOIA is when you object to the release of your confidential data that's in the government's possession, I'm not sure they're going to get away with even exempting these 2 fields. I mean, they seem to me to be within the zone of what the federal courts at least have generally said, yeah, I know you don't want to give it up, but tough luck. So in any event, that's where we are in terms of what will and won't be public within the 11 data fields in the TDR reports. And obviously, the government contracting offices that are using this for horizontal price analysis, in theory, will have access to all the fields. This is just which fields will be publicly available. So here are the specific schedule contracts, or contracts awarded to the following, pursuant to the following schedule solicitations are going to be covered by TDR. In some cases, just certain special item numbers or SINs within the contract are subject to TDR. And a SIN, for those of you that are not familiar with it, is basically a broad category description. So if we look down at Schedule 70, SIN 132.8 is computer hardware equipment. And so if you sell computer hardware equipment under Schedule 70, you're covered by SIN 132.8, or those items are covered by SIN 132.8. And what's interesting and what you need to understand about the rule is that if the contractor accepts the TDR clause for its contract, it then applies to all SINs under the contract, not just the designated SIN that's subject to TDR. And so, for instance, on Schedule 70, if you held SIN 132.32 for term software licenses, but you also held SIN 132.12 for software maintenance, or 132.51 for IT professional services, those would both also then be covered by the TDR reporting requirement. So if you opt in to any SIN, you then opt into the entire contract, regardless of which umbrella.
And given
SIN you're under.
Pilot program, I find that interesting to observe. Never mind some of the reporting ramifications that it has that we'll talk about a little bit later to prepare for this. But I think it's also an interesting roadmap to see what the next likely phase is in the expansion of the pilot program, because the way the clause works, having it included now, GSA is essentially getting a whole lot more than what the pilot program actually calls for. And how they bake that into their horizontal pricing analysis or any of those determinations is going to be interesting to watch, because they're getting a whole lot more than they think they're going to get in reality.
So does TDR apply to you? That's a rather important question. So all new scheduled contracts awarded under the TDR designated solicitations and SINs will include the TDR contract clause. That said, as of yesterday, I've not seen the clause included in a solicitation refresh. And so we may have a window here where you could get away with, if you're already in process, where you may get away without having to agree to the TDR reporting requirement. whether you want to do that or not is a different question, and we'll get to that. But so then, as you're aware, GSA schedule contracts, unlike VA schedule contracts, are structured as a 5-year base period and 3 5-year options. There's a formal renewal process that in many ways, especially with respect to pricing, have historically been treated like a new offer, and where you have to provide new CSPs, you may get a pre-award audit, that sort of thing. GSA has not provided clear guidance on this, but everyone seems comfortable saying that the renewal modification request format is going to be modified so that you have to agree to TDR as a condition of your contract extension. Tom, I don't think we've talked about this, but I don't know what your view on that is.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think there are going to be some interesting scenarios that we can talk about later about, the timing of how that works, and I'm sure there are people, if not on the phone now, or, are in the midst of this process saying, wait a minute, I'm doing a CSP now for renewal. What's going to happen to that? What do I want to do? And those are some of the big open questions that nobody really has an answer for right now.
And so if you're a schedule contractor with an existing contract that's under one of the TDR designated solicitations and SINs, you have the option to opt in, or you may elect to opt in to TDR, and the mechanism for that would be a bilateral modification, meaning you and GSA would both sign a modification agreeing that TDR clause comes in, CSP and PRC clauses go out. And we've gotten a question about whether or not, assuming you opt in either via bilateral modification immediately, or if you opt in a renewal to your existing contract, is that retroactive to the beginning of your contract when the PRC and CSP 1 requirements did apply? And you want to take that, or should I take it?
Well, you started it.
All right, I'll take it. So, all right, my view, my view is that if I were a contractor, I would maybe be inclined to put some language in the modification that said that the parties agree that it's retroactive. I don't think that's GSA's intent, and I'm quite sure that the Office of Inspector General at GSA would have a view that it's not retroactive, and if you've got price reduction or defective pricing issues in the past before your contract was modified for TDR, that you still own those, notwithstanding the modification. But it might be worth a try.
I would tend to agree with that. I think back in 1994, when the price reduction clause was modified into agreements, the new one didn't take effect until the new clause was in there. So you were subject to that going back to whenever the contract was awarded. So as you said, I think that anyone who thinks that it's going to be retroactive, or it's a nice wish, maybe it'll happen from time to time, but I think that's going to be the mythical unicorn for contracting that's out there.
Yeah, I would view it maybe as it's better than nothing. Maybe if my contracts professor in my first year of law school was describing equitable remedies in contracts, he said this is the argument you make as you're packing up your briefcase and apologizing to your client for having lost the case. So it's probably it's better than nothing, but I wouldn't treat it as a get out of jail free card necessarily.
No.
And so we're about to get into the upside and downside discussion, which I think is maybe the most useful part of our presentation today. But before we do that, we've gotten a number of questions from the audience that, Kristen, maybe we'll take just a couple of those now before we move on to this most exciting part of, I know you're all waiting with bated breath for this, but I want to get to these questions.
So the first question is, how much detail should be included in the description of deliverable field?
Okay, and as background, and I'll let Tom take this because he's a lot smarter about this type of data issue than I am, but just as background, that's one of the 11 mandatory fields. And so the question is, how do you fill that field out?
Yeah, it's a question that I think both Matt and I have been asked a couple times, so I appreciate that it was asked here on the call. My thinking would be that most companies will have some sort of an order processing or order entry system, figure price quote, whatever you call it internally, and your products or your services have some sort of a name that's there that's generally consistent with how that is named on your schedule price list. And I would say that that is where we should start to look at that for being the basis for what is reported, so that you are able to tie the product code, the part number, to the description. It does lead to some other things around what about configured products or solution sales, but maybe we'll touch on that a little bit in the downside or upside piece, unless another question comes in on that. But I would start with what you already have on the contract and the way that that is managed in your systems right now.
Okay. We have one more?
Sure. The next question, what are the consequences if you sign up to TDR but aren't able to submit the reports or at least certain data fields in the report?
Okay, that's for you.
So that's a question that I think, before you sign up to TDR, you probably should know the answer to that question, but the real world being what it is, it's certainly foreseeable that some people are going to sign up for TDR and then figure out that the manual process that's available initially to prepare the TDR data elements is more than they thought it was, and they are not able to submit those. The clause itself gives the government the right to terminate the contract for not submitting the reports in a timely fashion. My guess is that you would get some leeway from your contracting officer, at least for the first several reporting periods, if you're not able to do it. Eventually it may become a negative past performance notation. I'm sure this is going to end up on the checklist that the industrial operations analysts use when they come by to help you.
Definitely.
I'd love, we're here to help.
Yes.
And so I think it's something that would be a problem if it persisted over time and maybe even eventually a termination event, but much better to not submit it than to submit one that's inaccurate, and we'll talk about that.
I mean, I think going back to your original thing, since it's opt-in right now for many, many contractors, knowing the answer is very important ahead of time, but that gives you the perfect opportunity to design, develop, and test your report and see what it looks like, and are you comfortable, and does it tick and tie back to what you think is there. And then if you can do that, then maybe you have a way of mitigating whatever that exposure is, but you've done the diligence to do it. This should not be a knee-jerk reaction, as Matt said, to just opt in and figure it out later on. That's probably not a good idea.
But it will happen.
Oh, yes.
What are there, 20,000 contracts?
Something like that. A couple will do it.
The odds, I mean, human beings are involved, and
a couple will do it.
It keeps life interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the upside description. Obviously, I'm not going to spend any more time on this, but the relief from the dual burden and compliance risk of the pre-award disclosures and the post-award monitoring and potential reductions to GSA price and the compliance risk, that's huge. GSA is estimating that they're going to save industry $44 million in administrative burden. I think, as is typical, that is a wag at best. I have no idea how you would even, I don't think it's even that important, because everyone knows it's a big burden that's being lifted. I don't know why we try to quantify that. But in any event, that's the number that's been assigned.
I think there are some organizations who would argue that that dollar amount is their own reduction, never mind an industry-wide one.
That can't be right, but anyhow. Additional upside, consistency between various reporting requirements that contractors have across multiple contract portfolios. you'll get access to at least 9 of the 11 data sets or data elements for your competitors, which, depending on your industry and how smart you are and how, what sort of resources you have to go out and do competitive analysis, may be very helpful or not helpful at all, but it's a potential upside, an ability to analyze consumption patterns, and then reduce barriers to entry for small business concerns, all on the positive side.
And I would say those last 3 are the ones where you could make an arguable quantification of the upside there. In terms of the second and the third from the bottom, when I was in-house, I always thought it was very important to understand what your competition is doing. And a lot of government procurement information is publicly available. This is another dimension of that to help understand what's there. And I think any commercial organization that's not doing whatever it can to examine its marketplace and see where they stand, in addition to making their own determinations, you're not doing everything you can to help market into that customer segment. And then for the last one, most definitely for small businesses, I think a big barrier has been this specter of, there's a CSP and there's this defective pricing risk and the price reduction clause. And I think there are a lot of very small or small businesses that have been approached, I think in some cases by the government, to say, we'd buy more from you if you had a schedule, or they want to get away from having to be a sub to a prime on somebody else's and grow their market. So I think that there are some definite opportunities, particularly around the last 3 on here in terms of upside, that are meaningful.
Well, and I think also, as you're talking about that, I think even for some large businesses, they have historically decided at a corporate level that they just weren't going to hold a direct schedule contract because of the price reductions clause.
Yes.
You're still,
yes,
as a subcontractor, supplier, whatever you call it, you're still generally obligated to submit CSP disclosures through your reseller or directly to GSA, depending on how you want to do it. But you are relieved of the price reductions clause at the subcontractor supplier tier, and that has been an inducement for many large companies, including some clients of both of ours.
Yep. Now, unfortunately, there's some resellers who we know have said, we don't plan on taking advantage of the TDR. So if you're an OEM, you're kind of scratching your head saying, well, why wouldn't we want to do this? It would benefit all of us. But those are part of the, I think, discussions and learnings that are going on both in the government and within contractors right now as to what's the best approach to take.
Absolutely. And, to devil's advocate, if you're a reseller, it's, well, I don't have to do CSPs anyhow, and I'd prefer not to do a monthly report because I already do a bunch of reports. But on balance, it seems like that would be the right decision. But that's, I have reseller clients too, and if for any of you that are on, I apologize. Okay. Downside. What if you submit inaccurate TDRs? Presumably the Office of Inspector General is not going to decide that GSA Schedule contract pricing errors are no longer interesting or relevant, and they may well at some point come to take a close look at the accuracy of TDR reports, just as they've done with pricing disclosures and price reductions clause compliance over the past 15, 20 years. I do think, just from, without getting into the weeds about the False Claims Act, I think that they may have a more difficult causation or materiality case to make for flawed TDR data in terms of showing the government paid a higher price because what I submitted was faulty. With the CSP, it's easy. If you had told me that you were discounting to your best customers at 30%, not 20%, I would have had a 10% better price, so you owe me 10% on every schedule invoice plus, the fines and penalties and blah, blah, blah. So there's at least some potential both contractual and extraordinary, meaning False Claims Act penalties for faulty, defective, inaccurate TDR reports. Enhanced government leverage in price negotiations. Obviously, if the government has an ability to say, well, I'm the Navy buyer, and last week an Army buyer purchase this item for $100, you're trying to charge me $110, I want to pay $100. And so that's, you can see how it would be, at least in some, you know, especially commodity circumstances, how that would be helpful. You get access to your customers, your competitors' order level data in the TDRs. And
yeah, here's a free tip. When the data is available publicly, if you want to figure out if your competitor has opted in to TDR, look to see if their data's there. If they've opted in, their data's going to be there. If you don't see it, then you know they're still dealing with CSP and price reduction clause. Some of you might find that interesting.
And I think Tom and I would violently agree that you know, in some cases it may be unhelpful for your competitors to have access to your order level pricing, and that should be a consideration in whether you opt in or not. And in a lot of cases, you could care less. You know, if you're a professional services provider and somebody knows that you did a particular, you know, statement of work for $3.2 million, I mean, there's none of the other information there that would be
right. And the pricing is already, you know, if you think about it, the GSA price list already needs to be posted, and it's already public. So you're not really gaining anything other than you might have some empathy for their contracts function if that were to be, you know, part of your promotional makeup or not.
Right, and so it's sort of the, I mean, I guess to the extent there's benefit, you know, you already know what your customer or your competitor was able to negotiate for a GSA price, and this may help inform you what they're actually selling at and how relevant their GSA price is to their order price, which in my experience there are wide fluctuations. Yeah. I mean, some people sell real close to the GSA price all the time in certain industry niches, and in others it's not even retail. It's just a joke. But so anyhow, other downside, the time and cost to implement the system and procedure modifications that are necessary to retrieve the TDR data that you have to stick in the report. And my several clients that have started this process tell me that they've not had to do a whole lot, that all of the data fields are already, at least in these three instances, all of the data fields were already resident in their order entry and fulfillment system. They had to make, in at least a couple of the cases, maybe in all three, they had to make some adjustments to how they queried the data so that it would pull from the correct field. But Tom would actually know how hard this is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree that for an organization that is already selling on this scale, it's another report that has to be configured. I think the bigger issue is that while these 11 fields, they're there, if you can't get this information, you're already not pricing these orders or these task orders appropriately. But I think in looking at this report, what's going to come up is when you have difficulty differentiating between multiple contracts that a given customer is eligible to purchase. So as we know, GSA Schedule users also have access in a number of the commodity areas to a whole bunch of other contracts. And I think that's part of why TDR came about. So you need to be able to know that if Department of Interior is eligible to use your schedule and a GWAC and a couple other things you've got laying around for contracting mechanisms, your configure price quote or your order processing applications should already be able to differentiate which contract was used to price a given transaction. But even if the price is the same on two or more contracts, to do the TDR report appropriately, you have to be able to differentiate that. Never mind the fact that you should already be able to do it so you're not overpaying the IFF. But GSA doesn't really tend to care if you pay them too much. It may not be worth chasing that down, you know, so you over-report slightly, not a big deal. But for this, you really need to make sure that you can get to that underlying data, and I think that's where another degree of refinement probably needs to occur. And I think for some organizations, you know, I've got two clients right now where that's where they're finding their challenge is going to be. Yeah, we can get the data, but when you showed us that, we realized that we've got other issues around how we're administering not just federal contracts, but it's going to be a more widespread enterprise thing, and that actually has an impact on your bottom line overall. So it's an interesting little lever, I think, that the TDR might help a company improve some other non-federal activities as a result.
That's a good point. Okay, forecasting TDR problems.
That was one of them.
I say you're a slide ahead already. There is an extreme likelihood of misleading price comparisons, and we'll talk about what the root causes for these are going to be. The order pricing is not going to provide information about factors that even GSA has historically recognized as justifying extraordinary or lower pricing than your standard low quantity, onesie, twosie type orders that don't come with anything else. And so some examples of this are a competitively awarded BPA. When I was in-house, the Air Force would award 4 to 5 BPAs for all of their computer hardware products. And if you didn't have one of those BPAs, you weren't selling to the Air Force for 5 years. And so people would provide insane pricing to get on that. And so when you pull up a BPA order in that context, you would see an extremely low price that's actually justified because you're getting theoretically a fourth or a fifth of hundreds of millions of dollars of annual spend. Volume commitments, specials, other temporary price reductions. There are all kinds of reasons that contractors legitimately give pricing that shouldn't necessarily be available to somebody who just wanders in and wants 1 or 2 items with no other special circumstances. You can't get that out of the TDR data. You can, theoretically, as the buyer is doing their price analysis, if you have an opportunity for some back and forth and they're willing to listen, you can provide a justification, but without a doubt, there are going to be those type of, well, you sold it at $13 over here, I want $13, even though none of the circumstances that justify $13 apply here.
And that's where I think the initial use of this information, if it starts to get actively used very quickly after the reporting starts, I think this will be one of the first things that comes up. I think over time, when there are many months or many years of information, trend analysis will allow you to identify, okay, this is where the price actually is in the market, and then there are these anomalies that reflect unique BPA situations or more of these one-off deals. But that's going to take time to get there because the reports have to be filed, the information has to be visible, and the federal procurement folks have to know how to identify that and recognize what that is. So I think there's still going to be a large obligation on the vendor side to educate their customer about not only what they're proposing this time, but how it's different from previous or other procurements that they may be aware of. And that's why I always move back to know what your competition is doing and what's happening out there, because that's one of the only ways I think you can mitigate this or try to mitigate it.
Well, and you're certainly going to have instances, too, where it's, if I'm negotiating price with somebody and I've got a stick that I can beat them over the head with, I'm not sure I'm going to really care if it's off base because I've got a stick. I've got a stick, so I like to use it. So we've got these, we know, issues that are going to cause people to not understand why a lower price is not justified in a current instance as compared to past instances that are identified through TDR. But we also know that there are going to be items that are treated as the same that are not the same because the data in TDR is very high level. And so you could have instances where, if you sell items as a bundle, it's normally because you have too much of certain inventory, and so you build bundles and you sell them very cheaply because you can make them cheaply because they're all the same, and you're usually taking care of an inventory problem that has crept up on you. But that won't look any different than a customer configured item in the TDR report, because it's going to be the same widget that's described. Configuration differences are going to be difficult to identify in the TDR report unless you take very special care to include it in the report. And whether you want to do that or not, there's a benefit obviously to helping justify you can't have this orange for the price of an apple, and here's why this is an apple or an orange, not an apple. Yep. But at the same time, then your competitors get to crawl through that and take a look at it, and so that's not.
And so as you think about that, it kind of, I know we're going to talk about the challenges with the professional services in a second, but this idea of the configurable item is a really interesting one, because a lot of times what I've seen in a lot of manufacturers, IT, furniture, all kinds of things, you're essentially selling a configured solution, the intergalactic platinum version of X, and then you quote it that way on your RFP response, and then you get the award, and it's called that. It shows up as one line item. But we know it's actually built up of other things. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to manage that piece there? Or when we look at the order level pricing piece around some of the different terms, all those things factor into pricing. I had one client ask me, he says, well, could I just create new SKUs or new part numbers to reflect, here's my item with a warranty, here's my item without a warranty, and here's my item with kind of a warranty in there. And you've got different price points with it. I mean, sure, that's reducing a lot of things to a pure data discussion. Think about the modification to add those products to your GSA schedule that you have to have in order to put those in place. So it's really weird for some organizations who have these types of configurable solutions that are there, and what's the best way to, at a start, comply with the requirement, but then after you've complied with that first report, how are you going to defend the next quote you submit that's being challenged by the procurement person who's fresh off the GSA training and ready to use that data to do their horizontal price analysis? I want to talk to people who have that first conversation to really see how that goes. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, but you have a pretty good idea how it's going to go a lot of the time.
Yeah, not well.
So, and then there's the issue of value. Some things truly are a commodity, but most items, even COTS items, have different value attached to them. And it can be warranty terms, customer service and support options. We'll fix anything. We'll never question, whether you broke it or whether it was defective, or maybe we won't. A liberal return policy, the quality of material. And so understanding that, TDR doesn't mean that you can't issue a best value RFQ anymore, but if we take TDR to its logical extreme and all we're doing is looking at price, there's going to be no incentive for contractors to provide any value at all because it's not being measured. And so you can sort of see potentially this triggering a race to the bottom in terms of what contractors put on schedule, because they're going to be trying to push costs that aren't recognized out of the product. They're basically will be giving the customer what they're asking for, but maybe the customer's not going to want what they're asking for at the logical extreme of TDR.
And as a taxpayer, I kind of have to wonder about, okay, are we suddenly going to start buying, the lowest quality of whatever it is for the government to work? That's not to say we should go back to the day of the over-engineered screwdriver and the $4,000 toilet seat from the 80s. But yeah, this race to the bottom, a smart manufacturer is going to say, yeah, if I can't defend that, I'm going to get out or just put it there. And again, this is going to take time. This is, more than a year for us to get there, but we see it right now that this is a real issue that's going to be coming.
Yeah, and obviously, no disrespect to government buyers, and this is very solvable if, if there's something that's of value to you, you put it in your RFQ and make it a comparative best value feature. But you can see, again, with no disrespect, you can see how this is creating an opportunity for doing low price only, or low price technically acceptable in spaces where value should be quantified and rewarded as part of the government's decision about what's in its best interest. So with that, additional problems. I mean, how quickly this is a new paradigm for price analysis. And if you look at the GSAM guidance, it tells, and that's attachment B to the course materials. It tells the contracting officer at GSA that the first, in the cascading order of precedence that you use for price analysis, the first thing you should do is look at horizontal pricing, or the TDR data. And that's a paradigm shift, and how quickly are people that have been doing it differently going to come up to speed on that? How quickly is the training going to take place?
And the piece that goes on that also is if they, when you're doing this not just on a transaction basis, but if you're doing this with a new schedule, they still have the right to ask for other than cost and pricing data, whatever that is.
CSP to me, but
yeah, it sounds an awful lot like CSP, or for those of us, you can raise your nerd flag high right now, but who remember the DSMD, the discount schedule and marketing data sheet that the CSP was supposed to replace. They may go back to that to look at for this information. So, again, part of the problem that we're forecasting here that we see is it's a change, but depending on what you're selling, how it's sold in the marketplace that you're in, you may not actually get away from having to do CSP-type stuff that's there, because they won't be able to get the information and assess the value of these intangibles that are there.
Yep. All right, now here we are with 3 minutes left. We're on to the $64,000 slide. Should I stay or should I go? Do I opt in or opt out? Or do I opt in? Actually, you don't have to opt out. And this is a contractor-specific decision. There's no one-size-fits-all here. This assumes that you've got a covered schedule / SINs. But what you want to consider is going to be the same across all contractors. And so this is, if you're deciding whether you want to opt in, you got to think about, all right, what are the quality of my CSP disclosures on file with GSA? Am I very confident in those, or might I have CSPs that I'm building liability on top of with each sale? How large is your commercial business, so that what's the effort required to do new CSPs? What kind of burden is going to be lifted? Do you have formal, monitored, and enforced discounting policies and procedures? If you do, it's easier to disclose. It's also easier to monitor. If you don't, it's harder. How complex is the PRC mechanism that you negotiated? Is it very simple, and does it involve 3 customers, or is it all your commercial customers and you have a lot of them? And so you need to think about what is the burden that's going to be lifted there, and how much value is there to losing that burden and the compliance risk that's associated with it in your specific case. This is not a generalized.
Yeah, it's very specific, and one area where I know I've gotten a lot of questions from clients and people who I know in industry is in the IT-70 world, because as Matthew's indicated earlier in the discussion, a lot of them have moved towards the reseller model because they didn't want to deal with a lot of the stuff that's there. With the TDR right now, depending on where you are in your contract life cycle, considering these things that we're describing here, it might make sense, given the reduced burden that's there, for your organization to reconsider using the reseller model for some organizations. Because if you already sell directly anyway, what was the original reason for serving the federal market through a reseller? If it was the burden, you may have an argument now to bring it on board and bring that into the fold, with this reduced piece there. Again, there might be something that you have to do that looks like a CSP, but the fundamental, once you're over that threshold without a price reduction clause, that's usually what hangs up a lot of manufacturers. The CSP is something, it's a bump in the road you get over. The price reduction is what affects your ability to sell over the subsequent 5 years. So something to think about as well.
And do GSA pricing restrictions hamper what you're doing on the commercial side? And, you know, it's many commercial sales executive has said to me, it's the tail wagging the dog. Why, you know, we're bigger. Why do we have to pay attention to that stuff? So that's something, again, specific to you, you need to consider. Anticipated pricing pressure, you know, do you sell a type of product that is, you know, subject to misuse through, you know, the horizontal pricing, or are you selling professional services? No big deal. Hard to compare apples. There's no way to really do it even. Competitive harm, would it be harmful to you for your competitors to see your TDR reports or not? And it's going to differ from contractor to contractor. And then the last point, this is obviously an important one, is what are you going to have to do from a system modification perspective to meet the report requirements? Is it 20 hours of IT time, or is it a big deal? And that's something that you also need to know. So with that, we're at the end of our hour. As predicted, we did not get to everybody's questions, but as I mentioned, Tom or I will get back to you by the end of the week if we didn't get to your question today. And I guess on behalf of both of us, we appreciate the large group of attendees, and you know, if you have questions for either of us, we'd certainly be happy to hear from you outside the scope of the chat feature on this webinar software. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.